Okay. Everyone, welcome to your September edition of DC604. Our talk today is with Will Whittaker, independent security researcher on EdTech for security people. A couple things before we start. Mute yourself so we can hear Will clearly. If you need to ask a question, feel free to unmute or post it in the chat, and I'll monitor that, or in the Mars Slack. If you're not on Mars Slack, also post in the chat. We can post a link where you can join. We will have a couple of things today. We will have a poll that we're trying to decide the topic for November meetup, and we've got a handful of options. We want basically your opinion on what you're interested in more. We will also send out in the chat, as well as follow-up email through Meetup, a feedback form, basically asking how did you like the talk, but also asking for what additional topics you're interested in, or whether you want to present. We're always looking for new presenters. And by the way, we had a lot of people doing presentations as their kind of first talk at DC604. We're always happy to do that, and we actually provide guidance, and we can connect you with some mentors who can help you out to deliver that first talk and give you some feedback, etc., etc. So with that, Will, the floor is yours.
All right, cool. So this is AdTech for security people. As I mentioned, the slides are ugly. The reason why the slides are ugly is this is sort of an amalgamation of a few other talks slammed together, and with my employer's templates taken out because this is an unofficial talk. So with that, a couple of caveats. This is an unofficial talk, not done by my employer, and none of these opinions are necessarily my employer's, so don't get me in trouble. And the other thing is that ad tech is a really big field, and realistically, I'm not going to cover much of it. I'm going to cover a very narrow view of it because it's huge. And I haven't worked in all of the different places. I've only worked in certain areas, so I have a narrow view just because of that. And I'm going to simplify things a fair bit. If you're familiar with ad tech technology, you will see the simplifications, just in the interests of time. So first things first, I presume this is a security audience for the most part. And so none of you know the jargon. And the jargon is important because when you start talking to ad tech people, they will use all of this jargon as they explain how everything works, and you will have no idea what's going on, and it will be very hard for you to figure out what could go badly with all of that. In fact, it will be very hard to figure out, are they even running web applications, or what are they doing? How is this all working? So I'm going to take you through some of the terminology that you will hear if you're working in ad tech. And just sort of like as a sort of aside to that, I'm assuming the perspective here is from a security professional who is getting sucked into the ad tech world for some reason, because a client is asked them to protect something, or your employer says, hey, the marketing department's doing this thing, what do you think about that? Or you're concerned about your users and possibly like whether or not there are security implications about the ads that your users get. All of those sorts of things. So the assumption here is you're a security audience, but not an ad tech audience. So let's talk about that word audience. So in ad tech terms, audience are the people who see the ads. What this really means is browsers. Although sometimes it means more than browsers. It used to mean basically exclusively browsers, but now it also means things like in-app ads or in-video ads. And I'm not really going to talk much about in-app or in-video stuff because it's got its own technology stacks. But like stuff everywhere. Everyone in ad tech is lazy, just like everybody else in every other industry. And what they essentially did is tack those things on top of the web-based ads. So the protocols all work very, very similarly. They're just mashed together terribly. So the attack surface is worse. So then publishers. What's a publisher? A lot of the jargon in ad tech kind of comes out of that whole Mad Men era of advertising. And a publisher back then, of course, was, you know, a newspaper or a magazine or eventually a television program. So a publisher in ad tech terms is somebody who has content that wants to monetize it via ads. And that content might be pure content, right? It might be, you know, a website that just has some stuff up on it, or it might be an application or a hybrid of the two. More and more, it's oftentimes a web application. And of course, it might also be a mobile app, or it might be a video. So then that takes us to advertisers. Everyone knows what an advertiser is, or probably thinks that they know what an advertiser is. So it's somebody who has a campaign, and a campaign kind of means something a little bit special, but it all roughly aligns with what most people think an ad campaign would be. And it consists of creatives, and I'll get to what creatives are, that they want to use to drive traffic somewhere. Usually. Sometimes they're just doing basically impression-based advertising where they just want to drive awareness, but most of the time they want the traffic to go somewhere and do something. There's some sort of call to action. A creative is the ad, and it's generally a piece of JavaScript, possibly an iframe that contains JavaScript, but it's essentially the content that the audience will see in the ad tag. It's going to be the visual ad that they click on that sends them somewhere and gets them to do something. And now we get into the real fun stuff. So a bunch of this is from what we call programmatic advertising. And programmatic advertising is essentially what, like, the big players that when you hear about online advertising, that's what they're doing. That's what they run. Advertising way back in the dawn of the internet was just banner ads and things like that. And it was done manually. Somebody's job would be to go and talk to advertisers and say, hey, I run a website and it gets about this much traffic. Would you like to put some banner ads on my site? I would like to be paid whatever. And this model was great when it was done by newspapers, but there's a reason why newspapers are dying. It's because this model is sort of terrible for scale. And it turns out when we actually started to measure the value of advertising, that most traditional media advertising was vastly overpriced. When we actually started to measure what the result of a particular set of advertising was, it turned out that it just was not as valuable as the newspapers, as the halftime shows, et cetera, had purported it to be. And the price got driven down. And that price got driven down by the big ad exchanges, all the big players you're very familiar with. And this is kind of how that happened. So in that sort of ecosystem, we have what's called the demand side platform. And a demand side platform is used by advertisers to automate purchasing of a targeted audience on an ad exchange. You can kind of think of it as the equivalent of automated trading on a stock market. And really that is kind of what this is. This is a commodities exchange for eyeballs. So then we have a supply side platform, and this is used by the publishers to automate the selling of advertising. So really the selling of traffic. So a publisher will have a particular placement on their site or in their application that they want to sell, but they don't actually sell the placement generally, not anymore. What they sell is the individual impressions. Every single request that comes through gets sold individually, but at scale and programmatically. And oftentimes they do that on multiple ad exchanges because they want to get the best possible price. Ad servers are used both by publishers and advertisers, and they're essentially a system for managing creatives and managing placement. So the entire point of the ad server is really, it's think of it like inventory management, but it's inventory management for potential advertisements and potential impressions. And then you have the ad exchange, and as I mentioned, you can kind of think of it as it's a commodity marketplace, right? And it does automated buying and selling for ad inventory. These days, most of the time, that is run by some form of auction to get a true price. That didn't always used to be the case. Back probably 10, 15 years ago, the prices were oftentimes set by the ad exchange. I believe Google sort of started off doing that and then rapidly moved to auctions. There's been a bunch of different types of auctions that have been explored in terms of making that work. Suffice it to say, these days, most ad exchanges have some form of auction system to get a fair and true price. And then we have the data management platform, also known as a DMP, and it's used to enrich traffic from an audience with additional information. And this is probably more, I guess, important, scary. I don't really know the right word there, but it is the thing that when people project these ideas about ads tracking them everywhere, this is the component that's doing it. Not that the rest of the platform doesn't engage in tracking, but the tracking on pretty much every other player here is really used to make sure that somebody gets paid. The data management platform, that's where the heart and soul of the targeting information lives. And that's the thing that is actually doing that. So here's a very simplified picture of what we just kind of discussed. And I'll show you the picture and then I'll run through it all so that you kind of have an idea as to what exactly is going on here, like when an advertisement happens, like what happens when you see that ad. So let me take you kind of through it here. Now that you've kind of seen all these players and you see the arrows and you see they're talking to each other, let's go through what that looks like. So you have a browser and they show up at a publisher's site. They begin to download the content, right? Single HTTP request to the publisher's site starts to download it. And usually, the way it's done these days for programmatic advertising is there's a piece of JavaScript in the headers of that HTML that comes down, starts to render and run, and that sends a request to the publisher's ad server, giving information about the request. So basically it says, hey, I'm getting an impression on my content server, and it looks like this. It's from this IP, it's this browser, the placement is this many pixels wide by this many pixels tall, all of that kind of information. Maybe it has the referrer, maybe it has some cookies associated with it because maybe it came back from somewhere. All of that, that gets passed along to the publisher's ad server. The publisher's ad server, which is essentially it's this inventory management system. It knows what placement spots are available on the publisher's site, and it knows what things it would prefer to put in there. So if the publisher has a deal with an advertiser that is not programmatic, so say, they're running with some advertiser who's paying them a flat rate every month to run a banner or something like that, or a little pop-up or what have you, it might prefer that. But oftentimes there's a lot of placement where the publisher simply does not have an ad to put there. And this is where programmatic advertising comes in. So the publisher's ad server will go off and it will talk to what's called a supply side platform. A supply side platform is essentially yet another inventory management system, but an inventory management system that knows about exchanges and knows how to take an impression with all of the information that you have about that impression and send it up to multiple exchanges, one or more, in order to sell that impression. And this is the point where the data management platform comes into play for the most part. This is the bit where you've got that impression, you've got that basic information about it, you know it's IP, you know it's browser, you got whatever you got in the headers, right? Which, you know, may or may not be a lot, but it's you know, it's good. But you got that data. This is the bit where you start enriching that data in order to get a better price. So maybe you've got a data management platform that's linked up to, you know, a particular media company, and the media company goes, oh yeah, no, I recognize that guy. That guy's actually one of our streaming customers. Let me note down the fact that that's a streaming customer. Or, oh, hey, I recognize that cookie. That cookie is associated with somebody who's been looking at car ads up until this point. Let's mark them down as interested in car ads. That kind of thing. This is the point where that happens, is with that data management platform. And then the data management platform, or the supply side platform, takes all of that data associated with that request, and it puts it up for auction on one or more ad exchanges, right? It's looking to get the best possible price. So here's a picture.
We have a quick question in the chat, and I'm gonna rephrase. When you use some sort of an ad blocker like uBlock or AdBlock, etc., do they block the ad from being displayed usually, or do they block it from being like downloaded and bought and sold? Like, where in the process does the blocking happen? Do you know?
Yeah, I do know, and I was going to get to that along the way, but let me tell you right now, because like it's pertinent. You've asked the question. So when you have an ad blocker, we're looking at this picture right now, right? Like basics of programmatic ads. Where does that ad blocker actually happen? It blocks the publisher's ad server and the agency's ad server. Actually, it might just block the agency ad server. And you notice how we haven't talked about the agency ad server yet? We just talked about the publisher's ad server, sending the whole impression, the request, over to the SSP, which collects some data from the DMP and then puts it up on the ad exchange. Yeah, we haven't even talked about the thing you're probably blocking yet. Now, it might be blocking the publisher's ad server, but oftentimes, and I'll talk a little bit about this a little bit later because I've got some bits of slides, but once again, it's pertinent. I don't mind going off on a little tangent. Oftentimes in ad tech, it is very, very common for all of these parties to be, if they're not the same party, like the same organization. So the publisher's content server and the publisher's ad server might be running in the same infrastructure on the same domains. So you're not going to be blocking that without blocking the publisher's content server. Maybe the ad server is software as a service. That's pretty common too, but it's also very common for the software as a service versions to request a subdomain from the publisher in order to make it easy for all of the JavaScript to be able to transition through all of the redirects to work properly and for the data to pass through without breaking on cores or anything like that. So basically, people, you'll hear other, AppSec, web AppSec especially, people talk about all of these really cool security things that the browser has that like prevents all of these attacks. The ad tech industry basically spends most of its time disabling those features so that it can pass data around between all of these parties in totally sketchy ways. And I'll get to that. So long and the short of it is, odds are good what you're probably blocking is the agency's ad server, which is the tail end of this entire thing. Which is sort of why it's kind of funny when people are like, oh, I'm blocking ad servers and I'm not going to get tracked. It's like the tracking's already happened. Sometimes you do actually block the publisher's ad server, in which case you actually have blocked the whole thing. But that kind of doesn't matter either. So getting back to it. we have these demand side platforms. The demand side platforms, as I mentioned, they're kind of like, think of them like trading bots on a commodities exchange. They're used by advertisers to bid on impressions being auctioned. And essentially the idea is whoever makes the best bid on the impression is going to win. So the ad exchange basically says, hey, supply side platform who submitted this impression, this is the advertiser who won that auction, and this is the creative that they want you to show, and this is where you can go get it. And what's important to note is when the demand side platforms are bidding on this, all of that metadata that was put in by the data management platform, that metadata is sort of available to them, but it's not available to them in a like kind of pick and choose way. It looks more like this. Demand side platform will have a budget, and it'll be on an ad exchange, and it will say, I'm interested in bidding on impressions from men ages 18 to 34 in Ohio. What happens is the ad exchange will only offer those impressions to it. And so their bid will be, I'll give you $1 per 1,000, which is a ridiculous price, if you give me one of those. And then maybe the demand side platform will say, but I'll only give you this, I'll only give you a penny if it's not targeted, because the advertisers are basically using these as trading bots. They're attempting to arbitrage traffic. They're trying to figure out what traffic is going to convert on their side to a sale or an action or whatever they want to do. And they're trying to do that by matching demographics, by offering a bid on a particular demographic. And if they, for example, it's a law firm and they're doing this, and they know that they can make a huge amount of money on a divorce settlement. So they'll be looking for demographics and keywords and everything else around that they can use that look like traffic that is going to be somebody looking for a divorce lawyer. And they're going to pay a lot more for that. But at the same time, if they can pay little enough, they'll take any old traffic, because you might get lucky. As long as it's cheap enough, that's fine too. So the price ends up being essentially a way of judging how likely this particular impression is to match the criteria of the advertisers who want it for a particular purpose. So what gets really cool about this is that now that the ad exchange knows who won the auction, like all of those demand side platforms have, all of them have made their bids based upon what they think this impression is going to be, what categories it falls in. They made their bids. The ad exchange tells the SSP, hey, this is who won the auction. This is the creative that you're going to show, and this is where to go get it. And the supply side platform sends this down to the publisher's ad server, says, hey, here's this creative. This is where you're going to go get that. And it's just a URL. And the publisher's ad server responds to the original request. We have not closed the original TCP session. The original HTTP request has not yet even fully rendered the headers. And we're responding back to that original request made by that browser with the location of the creative on the advertiser's ad server. And remember, that creative is a piece of JavaScript. So that script tag is now has its source as the location of the advertiser's ad server with the creative there. And the browser then goes and retrieves that creative from the advertiser's ad server, inserts it into the HTML on the publisher's site, where it gets rendered, where it gets run. And when it gets run, the advertiser's ad server tracks the impression so the advertiser knows that the creative was served, so that they know that they got what they paid for. So once again, we're kind of looking at this picture here, and you kind of see that back and forth of the data. So you have a brand, which is, like that'd be like your Coca-Colas, and they're represented by an ad agency. if you're familiar with Mad Men, you kind of know what that looks like. And that ad agency would run a DSP, and that DSP is making bids on an ad exchange. And then on the other side, you have publishers who have all of their placements up on their ad server, which then talks to an SSP and puts those placements up on the ad exchange. There's an auction, matching occurs, and whatever the creative is that the brand wanted to show, so their actual ad, the thing that they want the user to see, gets passed, that URL gets passed down the chain, down to the user's web browser where it's rendered, and then the user's web browser makes an additional GET request out to the ad agency's server, and they pull that content there. Let's talk about what can go wrong, because anybody who sees that picture probably has some concerns, legitimate ones. So first, the obvious thing is lots of kinds of fraud, lots and lots of kinds of fraud. Anybody who's seen that picture and looks around and is slightly unethical can figure out ways of defrauding it pretty quickly. And they've all been tried. And there are workarounds for many of them. But the dirty little secret of the ad tech industry is fraud is everywhere. And it's a thing that you fight in the same way that like corner stores fight lossage. It never truly goes away. It's just a thing as to whether or not it's so bad that it breaks your business. The other thing that, of course, can go wrong is loss of reputation due to something being inserted in the publisher's site that they did not intend, or conversely, an ad being run on a publisher that the advertiser is uncomfortable with. The first thing, when that's malicious, that's really concerning. So there's a fair amount of just like outright malware that gets run on ad exchanges. There's a bunch of different ways that people try and fight that, but it certainly happens. But not everything is malware. There's plenty of other kinds of fraud that look sort of like that, but don't rise to the level of malware. In addition, all of these components that we just sort of like showed there, they talk with probably the worst protocols you will ever see, because this was all hacked together by ad tech people who are mostly marketers, and they hacked it all together to essentially make the browser do the heavy lifting. And then, you know, security people came along and they're like, oh, that sounds super sketchy. Let's add some security stuff into the browser to prevent like all this cross-site scripting stuff. And the ad tech people have done their damnedest to disable all of that. And then, of course, the thing that everyone is sort of top of mind is privacy and data loss. So let's talk a little bit about fraud first. So there's a bunch of different kinds of fraud that are sort of worth talking about if you're a security professional and, you know, somebody, say a publisher, for example, has, you know, brought you in to look at these things. You're doing like threat modeling or something like that. So one of the most obvious ones is that there's plenty of just plain browser malware floating around that all it does is either insert ads into publisher sites or looks for the creative IDs on publisher sites and changes them to its own creative IDs. Likewise, there are plenty of defacement groups who all they do is insert ads or change publisher IDs. And the thing about publisher IDs is there's no authentication in this ecosystem at all. You are your publisher ID if you're a publisher, and an advertiser is its advertiser ID. And there's no magic that makes any of that secure. If somebody changes the publisher ID, somebody else gets paid. So there's a fairly high incentive to change the publisher ID for the unethical. Likewise, usually those publisher IDs, they're often carried in cookies, like especially when you have like a repeat browser hitting your site, hitting the publisher site. So because they're in cookies, this is one that hit Amazon a while back. It was sort of fairly famous. You can change the publisher ID in the cookie and stuff your own cookies or pre-stuff cookies, especially if the publisher has not seen this before. You can add your own cookie, and then the publisher sees it, and they're like, "Oh, we're returning a returning user. Excellent. I will, use all of these things that are in the cookie because I don't know any better." And then the other one is, this one's actually kind of cool and subtle, and I think a thing that most people don't think about, especially security people, because it's not actually an attack on anything you're protecting. So there's a type of fraud involving, it's essentially domain spoofing. But the domain spoofing isn't at the DNS layer. It's literally creating traffic purporting to be from a publisher when it was never on that publisher. So you'll see this on oftentimes on streaming sites. Actually, that's where it's really common right now, where that streaming site, and we can all think of some fairly big famous ones, that streaming site does not run ads, but you'll see traffic on the exchange that purports to be impressions from that streaming site. And it's because somebody's just taking that domain and they're cramming it into an impression and saying, "Oh yeah, no, I've got some Netflix traffic. Anyone want to run an ad on Netflix? Seems super valuable." And for a variety of reasons, mostly due to the fact that like the bots are essentially all automated trading bots. Yeah, they will absolutely spend money on that. And what's kind of pernicious about this is it doesn't directly harm Netflix or whoever the streamer is. But what happens is it's traffic that that publisher isn't getting paid for. So it's kind of a weird kind of fraud. Luckily, the advertising industry does not like this. If there's one thing marketers hate, it's not being paid. And so they've come up with a kind of a protocol, for lack of better words, called ads.txt. And essentially it's a text file. It's very similar to robots. It's a text file that says, these are the places, these are the SSPs and ad exchanges that are allowed to be selling traffic from me. And reputable ad exchanges will go to the domain that is purportedly being sold for, the impressions that are showing up on them. They will go to that domain and they will retrieve ads.txt, and they'll go, "Hey, you're selling this traffic, but you're not supposed to be selling this traffic. We're not going to sell it on because that's fraud." And app ads.txt is basically the exact same mechanism, but like with more stuff tacked on to deal with mobile applications and now video. One thing that I think probably should be mentioned, because I gave this very simplified picture right at the beginning, where you all kind of saw it there. Ad exchanges also have other ad exchanges who have other ad exchanges who have other ad exchanges, who may be DSPs or SSPs themselves. So one ad exchange may be retrieving impressions or making bids on another ad exchange and doing its own arbitrage, and so on and so forth. So like this could be quite the chain. But let's talk about more fraud. So the very first thing that I think everybody thinks when they first see this ecosystem and how it works is if you have any sort of ability to program at all, you think, really, these people will pay for clicks. I can make clicks. And of course, that's actually very common. So fake and fraudulent traffic is a thing. It's actually a fairly big problem within the industry. But in the last probably 5 years or so, there are now some vendors who will protect against this, and you pretty much really want a vendor. It's a very specialized type of anti-fraud, figuring out whether or not something is a bot or not. The fact that I use that catchphrase should tell you who one of the biggest vendors of this is, if you know anything in the field. But you want a vendor, and what's actually key and critical here is you want a vendor. You want to make sure that the exchanges you're dealing with have a vendor. If the SSP isn't you, you want them to have a vendor, and you want to make sure that that vendor kind of matches up with whatever the advertiser is using as their vendor as well, because you're not going to get paid for anything that vendor says is fraud. So if you, the SSP, who are dealing with, you have, say, a bunch of publishers below you. If those publishers are showing up and you don't have a vendor figuring out whether or not that traffic's fake or not, the ad exchange, who does have a vendor, is not going to pay you. And if you, the ad exchange, don't have a vendor, the DSP and the agency that's running that DSP, they're not going to pay you when they have a vendor. So it's kind of in everyone's interest to make the chain complete of verifying traffic. But not all fraudulent traffic is fake traffic. So just to use like straight up examples of brands, Coca-Cola does not want their ad to show up on Pepsi's site. If it does, that's probably fraud. Major famous brands, Coca-Cola as an example, but any famous brand doesn't want their traffic to show up on, say, porn sites or political extremism, or a whole host of other things. And when that happens, and there's a whole set of attacks around essentially masking what site the traffic is actually coming from while purporting to be from somewhere else. So you can take advantage of the huge amount of traffic you're getting on your porn site, but pretend it's actually CNN, as an example. So brand safety is also a huge concern. And there are brand safety vendors you're probably going to want to make sure you're engaging one, because the exact same issues of you're not going to get paid if it turns out that you're reselling traffic from somewhere that is not where it actually purports to be from. And then of course the I don't know if this is the most common, but it's pretty common. All of these things that I've kind of like laid out with that little diagram there, they're all web applications. They all have, especially the SaaS versions of them, they all have user accounts with multiple users, with multiple companies being served as customers. And account compromise and phishing is incredibly common in these things. And it's a great way to defraud people, because you just change the bank account that the money goes to, and then somebody else gets paid. And anybody who's dealt with PCI will be shocked and horrified by the type of accounting practices and the lack of rigor that they are used to from PCI in the advertising industry. Money essentially changes hands based on PDFs, PDFs and phone calls and a web interface where somebody changes a number and that goes to a different bank account. The ability to commit massive amounts of fraud just based on a little bit of phishing is actually amazing. But thankfully, we only get a little bit of it, I guess. Phishing seems to be concentrated on other places. So fishers, stay away from my stuff because it's not well protected.
Well, there's another question.
Yeah.
Is the money flow restricted to national, regional borders?
Oh, hell no.
Okay.
Yeah. I can't verify that there's money laundering, but there's probably money laundering. So let me pose a hypothetical that I may or may not have been involved in. Say there is a Russian crime syndicate generating fake traffic. And they're doing so in Russia, but purporting to be, say, American traffic. They're going to get paid by all those advertisers for that traffic, and it will look like totally legitimate money. If they have a bunch of dirty money and they use that dirty money to buy a bunch of malware to generate that fake traffic, their dirty money has magically been turned into clean money because they can essentially hire malware professionals, hire people to, say, hack sites and change publisher IDs, or to put out malware that generates traffic, or to put out malware that just straight up changes creatives. And when the advertisers pay for those things, it's legitimate advertising money. It's now magically clean. So that's a thing that definitely happens. And I've been involved in that like actually pops up on everyone's radar who's a security professional, because it sounds like the exciting thing. It's not actually the exciting thing, but it sounds like the exciting thing. And that is creatives are obviously JavaScript, and you can put them up on these exchanges and pay people to run them, and people will do that. And so there's really no difference between a creative and a cross-site scripting attack. It's the same thing. It's somebody else's JavaScript being run on your website in the context of your domain. And yeah, you can absolutely say, sure, I'll pay $10 for you to run this JavaScript and put it up on an exchange via DSP, and that will happen. What's important as a publisher is that you deal with a reputable ad exchange who will have a vendor specifically devoted to executing those payloads, those creative payloads, and trying to make sure that they're not straight up malware. Obviously, that's difficult. Obviously, stuff is missed. But reputable ad exchanges are reasonably good at preventing that from happening. And they're reasonably good at preventing that from happening, both because they'll have a vendor that detonates those things and does static analysis in order to look for potential malware. But also the entire industry is heavily reputationally dependent. So an ad exchange, if they get reports from malware from a particular agency or a particular set of DSPs, they're going to stop dealing with them. Because if they don't, publishers are going to stop using that exchange, because nobody wants malvertising on their site. So it's really just a matter of making sure you're dealing with a reputable ad exchange, and obviously like not doing things that look like they are too good to be true. If somebody's paying you all the money in the world to run an ad, maybe you should kind of consider if that's, like too good to be true. Let's get into the good stuff. I think this is the good stuff anyway. As somebody who looks for vulnerabilities, I'm not gonna tell you about specific vulnerabilities, but I'm gonna point you in a direction where if you go looking, you will find them. So as I kind of mentioned, ad tags, they're just JavaScript script tags, right? Like they're just script tags. They're HTML script tags. That's all they are. Maybe they're an iframe that contains a script tag, but they're script tags. And the source of that script tag is going to point to the publisher's ad server initially, and all of the data that they want to pass to the publisher's ad server, it's going to be collected up and passed in URL parameters on the GET request, because it has to be a GET request. It's a source for a script tag. So if they want like a particular placement, or they want to restrict it to a particular campaign ID or prefer it or something like that, because they want to tell the SSP that actually, they have a direct deal with this advertiser for this particular placement, or whatever that might be, right? That all has to go into those get params. Likewise, when that script tag runs, when it gets the results back from the giant chain of all of the things from the ad exchange, when that script tag runs, it's going to in turn add in another script tag, which is the advertiser's ad server. And likewise, it's going to jam a bunch of things in the GET request. And it's going to do that because it wants to know that it got what it paid for. The advertiser wants to know that, like, when they bought on a particular demographic, did they actually get that demographic, or did they get some other nonsense? So they're gonna put a bunch of things in that GET request: the campaign ID, the creative ID, all of those sorts of things. Maybe whatever cookies that came along, maybe the referrer, any headers that they can grab if they can grab them, all sorts of things, because it's all useful, good stuff. They're gonna put it in there. And nobody wants to do that manually because that sounds like a pain in the ass. So pretty much every ad tag implementation has some form of substitution macro. And if you've ever dealt with placing an ad tag, whoever the ad tag provider is, they will have like a substitution macro language. And it is really, really simple usually. It will say something like, $refer, and that replaces, that goes out and gets the referrer and replaces it. And this will allow you to put in server-side variables that you might have into the GET request, or go get things from the client headers that you can only get from the server side and jam those into the GET request so you can pass them along the chain. There are so many parser bugs. Like, everyone's little spidey sense should be going off and thinking to themselves, well, that sounds like all of the things that normally get people into trouble with cross-site scripting and with injection attacks in general. And you'd be right. There's huge amounts of parser bugs because you have a URL which is being parsed in order to add each one of those params. So if the parser screws up, now you're adding extra params. Maybe you're being able to override other params that should or should not be there. Second of all, the JavaScript is going and getting those things both from the server and oftentimes from the client by way of the server. So anything you pass along there is probably under your control. It's a piece of JavaScript that is generally not written by the bestest of the developers. So things like prototype attacks on JavaScript, totally plausible. But yeah, all of those good sort of parser bugs, they're all there. And the great thing is like, sure, you might be able to do, say, like a prototype attack on that JavaScript and get what is effectively a reflected XSS, or you might be able to pass that further up the chain and be able to attack other things. Oftentimes you can get things like server-side request forgery out of it, which is great. So the other thing about how ad tech works is redirects and proxies are everywhere. My employer participates in a bug bounty program. I don't think a week passes where we do not get somebody reporting one of the many open redirects that we have. And every time we go, that's just how it works. That's how ad tech works. You put an open redirect so that your JavaScript can show up on somebody else's domain so that it'll run correctly. That's how it works. You put the redirect so that you can pass params to the next guy up in the chain, who then passes them again to the next person, maybe adding a cookie. Maybe that's how the data management platform works. you pass the request along to it, and it does a redirect, adds the information into the get params as it does the redirect, and passes it back or passes it to the next person in the chain. Likewise, that's how the SSP works. It's just a redirect. It's a redirect where it changes up the URL and redirects it with new params so that it goes to the right place. And as I mentioned previously, giving a subdomain to a partner so that this will all work is likewise very, very common. And hopefully everyone knows what can go wrong with this. But obviously, if you've got a subdomain, you're kind of opening yourself up to all of those sorts of cookie stuffing issues. You've essentially given a certain amount of permission to running within the browser context on your site. So all of this ad tech stuff, yeah, it's got this huge attack surface. But you have to remember, it's running on the publisher's application or website. So if you can attack this, you can attack that application. You can attack its authentication. You can do cookie stealing attacks on that. The other thing that I think is really kind of worth mentioning with this is because of all these redirects and because of all of these like proxies, et cetera, that are kind of like all over the place, tracking malicious traffic can actually be a real challenge, because that simple picture that I showed where the browser to the publisher's ad server to the SSP to the exchange to the DSP to the agency to the brand, every single one of those little circles and boxes might represent 5 or 6 of the same thing chained together with redirects or proxies. Tracking who did the bad thing when that happens, really difficult. And likewise, putting a WAF in front of all of this is hilariously terrible, because the way that ad tech works is it is cross-site scripting by design. Your WAF will false positive all the time. One other note to make, because of all of these, all of the proxies involved. So I kind of don't mention it in the notes here, but let me kind of point out. So the way that a lot of scale is achieved within the industry is by heavy use of CDNs. Both CDNs that are vendor provided, so the usual suspects, right? Your Fastly's, your Akamai's, et cetera, but also internal CDNs. And while your Fastly's, your Akamai's, et cetera, are generally pretty good at fixing things like cache poisoning and request smuggling attacks when they come out, the internal stuff tends to linger. There's lots and lots of proxies and load balancers that are effectively proxies lingering in the infrastructure of all this in order to make it scale. Because keep in mind, your average ad tech exchange is doing millions of requests per second. In order to make that scale, you have to have tons of load balancers. And those don't get updated quickly. And you will be able to see lots of request smuggling possibilities, lots of cache poisoning issues. They're really, really common. So let's talk about this ad thing, privacy and data issues. We've already kind of talked a little bit about it. Really, I think the big points here is data management platforms are actually the thing you should be worried about, but it's not the thing that people worry about. People kind of imagine that, like, if somehow they don't hand out cookies to the advertiser, this will magically make it so that they won't be tracked. And individually, this is probably true. Your cookie blocking scheme, whatever it might be, is probably going to work. It won't work at scale. You can tell it won't work at scale because all of the major browsers, well, I shouldn't say that. All of the browsers that were not Chrome have some form of third-party cookie blocking at this point. It makes no difference. Chrome was going to put in third-party cookie blocking, and with their own new scheme that essentially is all of those demographic data categories automatically sent up, they got their wrist slapped over it and they kind of backed off, and they're still doing third-party cookies. But the point is, it doesn't matter. The tracking is pernicious. The tracking works based on IPs, which get passed around. The tracking works based upon caching in DNS layers, based upon clock skew, based upon DNS cache. All of these sorts of things allow tracking. And in a lot of cases, it doesn't matter anyway, because nobody's interested in tracking you, the individual. They're interested in tracking men between the ages of 18 and 34 from Ohio who want to buy a truck. And that doesn't go away when you block cookies. So nobody really cares. I mean, privacy people care, but the total effect of GDPR in Europe was essentially consolidation in the ad tech industry. For the most part, the ad tech giants got bigger and the small players got squeezed out. And the reason was really simple. The ability to afford lawyers, the ability to afford a privacy department that could do GDPR stuff, and the ability to absorb the liability. All it did was concentrate all of that private information in fewer hands, which means a single set of people know more about more people. So I see a lot of people saying things about privacy and about like all of these sorts of like grand schemes about how, you know, we can fake cookies and send out all of these like fake pieces of traffic and like we'll hide in the chaff. And it doesn't work because that's not where the data is coming from for the most part. The data comes from your ISP selling what IPs are located in what neighborhoods, and the polling company selling what zip code is responsible for what political beliefs or what income distribution, what IPs are associated with what geographic data, all of those sorts of things. That's where the data comes from. The cookies are kind of incidental. Anyway, questions?
There was one question asking whether the ISP data sale is illegal in Canada.
I don't know. And it's bordering on things I'm not supposed to talk about. So definitely Canada has privacy law. But if you've ever dealt with Canadian privacy law, you know that it is both toothless and useless. It doesn't do anything. Nobody ever gets penalized over it. And there are loopholes you can walk through easily. If you've ever dealt with, say, a major bank or a major telecom or any big company, you'll notice that like their terms of service say, and we use your data to do this stuff. And then you agree to it. And privacy law is satisfied. So yeah, if they did something like really sketchy, it would be illegal and they'd probably get a slap on the wrist. But the reality is you probably signed an agreement that says they're allowed to share their data, your data, with their partners. And I guarantee you, those ad companies are their partners.
All right. I don't see any other questions. Thank you so much, Will. A lot of it was way over my head, but interesting nevertheless. I'm going to stop recording now. And